Hi, and welcome to the 3026 Breakdown. I'm John Lee, and today I have a very special PSA-themed episode called How Racist is MMA Actually? So, recently, Tyron Woodley has been in the news, and not for retaining his belt in the split decision with Stephen Thompson, but for coming out and saying that, in his opinion, he's been treated differently because of his race. Now, you would think that if people were martial artists, which is a whole different badge between martial artists and real fighters, that traditional martial artists would know that there's a long and detailed history of racism throughout the martial arts, with many teachers being expelled for teaching either Middle Eastern or black students. But most MMA fans don't think about that. Instead, most MMA fans say, oh, I don't see any racism, and there's other reasons to dislike Tyron Woodley. Well, I'm here to say that if you're thinking that, why don't you pause on that for a second, and instead of telling the black person from Ferguson, Missouri, what you think race relations are like in 2017, let's go through and do a little history of racism in the UFC and traditional martial arts. I want to start with Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson, there's a great documentary about him, but Jack Johnson was basically thrown in jail for being the first black heavyweight champion. You can look at the laws and the white women trafficking or whatever they actually called it, but they were clearly after him ever since he won the belt and refused to stop being seen in public with white women. So there's a whole better documentary than anything I can say on here. But Jack Johnson, first of all, it took him forever to get the title, and what's his name, either Corbett or the Australian dude, like made a whole bunch of super racist comments about how, you know, they'll never fight a black guy. So there was that before he even got the title. Then he was basically imprisoned for being the black heavyweight champion and being outspoken. But let's go to traditional martial arts. Let's talk about a guy named John Keegan, better known as Dante Fury. When the martial arts boom happened in the 70s and late 60s, there was a big spurt up of karate places. Bruce Lee was all over the place. But there's a guy you never hear about who was actually the world's most dangerous man and the best karate fighter alive during Bruce Lee's era. The reason you don't hear about him is because he was black, and his name was John Keegan. You can look him up. There's a great documentary about him as well. But again, this stuff goes through traditional martial arts. It goes through all of these different places, which brings us to Wonder Boy and his white privilege. Because Wonder Boy doesn't really think that there's anything wrong with the way Tyron Woodley is being treated. Let's leave out the fact that Wonder Boy was clearly who the UFC wanted to win that fight based on the marketing. Let's leave out the fact that Wonder Boy has a traditional martial arts background through karate and other various bullshit American kickboxing. But Wonder Boy's been around. He knows the history of martial arts. So him not seeing this pattern tells me that A, either he's too rooted in white privilege, and hey, I'm white, I understand it, right? Like, it's hard to see outside of your own experience. You don't get harassed by the cops. You think like, well, I don't get harassed by the cops. All you have to do is be respectful. And that's where you get spouting all these respectability politics and statistics about Chicago black on black crime, which if you go all the way back to 1912, politicians were using as a trope to trot out racist policies. Or they talk about, you know, the need for the black family to have fathers while leaving out that divorce rate is 50% across races. There are tons of white kids who grew up without fathers as well, but we never bring that up because we only bring up the single family and the single mother when we want to talk bad about black people. So those are just a couple of examples of privilege and how we don't even see this as white people. Now, all of this stuff reminds me of the book Friday Night Lights by Buzz Bissinger. And if you read that book when you're young and you just think about football, then you'll think about it in one light, whereas it's the story of this small town football team. But if you think about it and read it from a sociological point of view, you'll see that really this is all about tribalism, and fighting brings out the tribalism in us, right? There was that big fight with Jerry Cooney, the Great White Hype in the 80s. This is a trope that's trotted out over and over again. Floyd Mayweather got out there against Oscar de la Hoya in the sombrero and the poncho. Race is used as a way to sell fights and has been forever because it comes down to a simple identification, right? When you have people who are poor, like in Friday Night Lights, you have a bunch of kids in this poor, small Texas town, and the only thing that makes them feel better about themselves is rooting for or being a member of this football team, past or present, that wins all these games. The same thing happens with fighting. It's the same reason you see the Irish fans who are so into Conor McGregor, right? They don't really have that much going on in their lives, so they dress up like him. because for him, he's now turned being Irish into a point of pride. Now they can feel better about themselves. And that's what a lot of this race stuff is. And that's why it's really important that we understand that it's stupid, it doesn't make sense, and the code language that's used needs to be called out. When they talk about black athletes being articulate, being well-spoken, that's code. When you hear about an athlete being explosive, athletic versus a gym rat, or heady, or smart, these are coded words that are being used to keep this framework in place. And I'm not even going to get into the systemic racism that pushes people of color away from STM programs and math and towards athletics and entertainment, but that exists as well. Instead, I want to just look at some things that have happened inside of MMA. Let's take a look at Melvin Costa. Melvin Costa came out to fight in mixed martial arts with this clearly racist tattoo. There's also many other guys who fought in MMA with clearly racist tattoos. In fact, there was a law enforcement organization that actually felt the need to put together a document looking at the influence of white supremacist groups in mixed martial arts organizations. So how's that for you? He's not the only one. There's another one that said, like, glad to be white. You can Google these. There's a ton of these. They are not isolated incidents in and of themselves. Or let's talk about Danny Van Herden, who on The Ultimate Fighter posted this lovely image of his African-American opponent being compared to an ape. But no, there's no racism in MMA. Or let's talk about the time Roy Nelson, right? Everyone loves Roy Nelson. Fat Roy Nelson, jolly Roy Nelson, funny Roy Nelson. Let's talk about the time he called Daniel Cormier and Uncle Tom leading up to his fight. Is that acceptable? Was that a big deal? If you were in a major sport, if someone in the NBA called LeBron James and Uncle Tom, I'm pretty sure that would have been a bigger deal than this incident that's largely been forgotten. Roy Nelson's still everyone's fat favorite fighter, but he used some really heavy racial language when promoting a fight with DC, who's like one of the good guys in the sport. So as you can see, there's a lot of racial history. It got so bad that Joe Rogan is not the most politically correct dude, right? Joe Rogan's whole thing is like being too macho for political correctness and saying a bunch of like misogynistic stuff under the guise of bro science, right? He had that quote where he talked about how the female monkey was weaker because she was evolutionarily designed to be held down by the male monkey. So Joe Rogan, he's not really here for your political correctness. And Joe Rogan even went out of his way to say that he thinks John Jones is mistreated because of him being black. He also then had the quotes about Kimbo where he said that he was overdosing on fried chicken and grape soda. So, you know, 50-50. But if Joe Rogan can see the problem with racism in MMA, then all of us in the white mixed martial arts media, because mixed martial arts is a very largely white and male dominated sport, from Dana White, insert Dana White jokes here, all the way down to the lowest levels. You just don't see a lot of female reporters. There's like Fernanda Pradas, Maggie Hendricks, Steffi Hayes, and that's about it, right? You just don't see it. So we all need to pause, and instead of telling Tyron Woodley that he's totally wrong, maybe look at where he's coming from, and instead of dancing around these issues and using the coded language, how about we stop for a second and think? Because otherwise it'll just be me here, because I don't dance.